There are dates that are not forgotten. November 3rd, 1943 is one of them. That morning, before dawn, the loudspeakers of the Majdanek concentration camp began to broadcast Viennese waltzes, marches, tangos. The music was playing non-stop, too loud, too cheerful. It was to cover up another sound. The sound of machine guns that, a few tens of meters away, killed 18,000 Jews in less than 24 hours. The guards who participated shared 2 liters of vodka and 200 cigarettes per head. That night, some went to the barracks to drink and show off to each other. One had his boots stained with blood. Most of those men and women were never tried. Those who survived the war went home, got married, had children, worked in offices and factories. They carried their secrets with them to the grave. But the files remained, the captured logs, the testimonies extracted in trials that lasted decades. And in that material, in thousands of pages of interrogations, minutes of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, judicial investigations of the Federal Republic of Germany in the 1960s and 1970s, are the 18 secrets that the SS wanted to bury forever. What you're going to hear isn't speculation. That's what the documents say. For decades, the narrative was comfortable. Members of the SS and police battalions killed because they had no other choice. They obeyed or died. The order came from above, and the individual could do nothing. It was a lie. On July 13, 1942, before dawn, Major Wilhelm Trapp gathered the men of the 101st Reserve Police Battalion in the dark, on the outskirts of the Polish village of Józefów. Trapp was 53 years old. His men affectionately called him Papa Trapp. That day he had to inform them of his mission, to surround the town and kill 1,800 Jews. All those who could not work, women, children, the elderly, were to be shot on the spot. Trapp was pale. His voice trembled. With moist eyes, he did something his superiors did not expect. He offered older men who did not feel capable of carrying out the mission the possibility of moving away from the execution squad. Barely a dozen men, out of nearly 500, stepped forward. Historian Christopher Browning documented this episode extensively in the 1980s, after gaining access to the court files of the Hamburg Public Prosecutor's Office, which for a decade, between 1962 and 1972, interrogated more than 210 members of the battalion. The minutes reveal something that very few wanted to admit. Throughout the whole day of slaughter in Józefów, men who felt unable to continue firing could ask to be relieved. Several did. A 40-year-old barber named Hans Dettelmann told his lieutenant that he had a very weak nature and was sent to another post. A former cigarette sales representative named Walter Niehaus shot an elderly woman once, then approached his sergeant and told him that his nerves couldn't take it anymore. He was not punished. No one was. Towards the end of the day, a Bremerhaven policeman described in his interrogation 20 years later a justification that he himself had developed while shooting. He decided to kill only the children, because without their dead mothers, they could not survive. He used the German word erlösen, to liberate, but also to redeem, in a religious sense, to describe what he was doing, but most, simply, did not turn away. According to Browning's calculations, at least 80% of the men assigned to the firing squads continued firing until all 1,500 Jews from Józefów were dead. Major Trapp himself asked that the matter not be discussed. By the time the trucks returned to Bugaraj, several men were covered in brains and blood. That night, someone woke up firing his gun at the ceiling of the barracks while he was sleeping. The next morning, everything went back to silence. The taboo had been established. What Trapp knew, what his men knew, was that no one was going to shoot them if they refused. They could ask to be transferred back to Germany. They could fake an illness. A lieutenant named Buchmann did so, explicitly claiming that he was not suitable for tasks that were not proper to the police. It took months, but he was transferred. The option always existed. And that's the most awkward secret of all. Orders to kill were not put in writing. The SS learned this from the beginning. In Majdanek, the second largest concentration camp in the Nazi system, with between 78,000 and 250,000 dead, according to different historical estimates, the extermination directives came verbally. The commander received instructions from the Concentration Camp Inspectorate, or the SS Central Economic Administrative Office, WVHA, in Oranienburg, and transmitted them to his subordinates in the same way. Historian Elissa Mailander, who studied for years the documents of Majdanek's Düsseldorf trial, 1975 to 1981, confirmed that the camp's internal records demonstrate a systematic gap between what appeared on paper and what happened in reality. When prisoners died, the names of the deceased were replaced in the record books with those of new arrivals who had not yet been officially registered. Thus, in the documents, the dead disappeared without a statistical trace. It was a system of accounting for corpses designed to conceal the scale of the extermination, even from the internal auditors of the SS. To this system had to be added another equally effective mechanism, linguistic euphemism. The order to clean a barracks did not mean sanitizing it. The term special action was not a security operation. The code was so dense and so internalized that when veterans were asked in the Hamburg interrogations of the 1960s what they meant by special action, several answered without hesitation, gunfire. It was what everyone knew it meant. The bureaucratic architecture of this cover-up started from above. The prisoner classification system at Majdanek assigned each inmate upon arrival a color code, the so-called chevrons, or triangles of cloth, that determined his status and his place in the camp hierarchy. In April 1942, a sequential numbering system of 20,000 numbers was also introduced, which were recycled. When a prisoner died, his number was reassigned to the next one who arrived. The result was that at no time was there a reliable record of how many people had actually passed through the camp, nor how many had died. The telexes that the head of guard Elsa Erich sent twice a day to Oranienburg with the prisoner counts reflected numbers that the camp administration had systematically manipulated. The WVHA, which since 1942 had controlled all the concentration camps under its Office D, issued a directive in August of that same year to reduce mortality in the camps. But the directive did not come with supervision mechanisms or consequences for non-compliance. Majdanek's administration ignored her. He did not improve sanitary conditions nor the quality of the food, which consisted mainly of turnip or nettle soup at noon and in the afternoon, plus dandelion coffee in the morning, nor did he intervene in the brutalizing treatment of prisoners by the guards. The only thing that changed was the ability to disguise the real figures. The camp also functioned as an accounting maneuver for the assets confiscated from the victims of the Holocaust. The camp's warehouse for personal effects, the Effektenkammer, was exceptionally large, not only because Majdanek was also an extermination camp, but also because it functioned as a temporary depot for shoes and clothing from Operation Reinhardt's extermination centers, Bełżec, Sobibor and Treblinka. The SS clothing factories set up in the former Lublin aviation plant, the SS Bekleidungswerke, processed, disinfected and packaged these belongings for shipment to the Reich. It was an integrated production chain where mass murder generated raw material for the state economy. Commander Karl Otto Koch, the first head of Majdanek appointed by Himmler in the summer of 1941, was dismissed on August 1, 1942 on charges of corruption and embezzlement. Not for killing prisoners, that was their official job, but for illegally enriching themselves with the property confiscated from the victims. Koch had built a private system of wealth extraction within the Reich's public system of wealth extraction. It was too visible an anomaly, too scandalous even for the SS. The Nazi state had rules about how to distribute the loot. Appropriating it individually broke the chain of profits upwards. Commander Hermann Florstedt, Majdanek's third official, was also dismissed and prosecuted on corruption charges. His successor, Martin Weiss, former commander of Neuengamme, Arbeitsdorf and Dachau, came to office in November 1943. Weiss had previously managed some of the most lethal fields in the system. His move to Majdanek was a movement of ordinary personnel, and that's how the system worked. Men with mass records behind them could continue to be promoted or reassigned as long as they didn't break the rules of internal accounting. SS Judge Georg Conrad Morgan, a civilian lawyer forcibly recruited into the SS General in 1943, discovered this structure when he was sent to investigate corruption cases in Buchenwald. His investigations progressively extended, and he eventually uncovered the machinery of mass murder. The document he presented to the Nuremberg Tribunal, where he testified in August 1946, revealed that he had succeeded in prosecuting several officers for individual crimes, but that the system itself, the policy of extermination, remained in a legally untouchable zone. By April 1944, Himmler himself ordered him to stop his files. The internal justice system had reached its own deliberately designed limits. Documents captured at the end of the war, microfilmed by the American Historical Association between 1956 and 1963 in collaboration with the National Archives in Washington, revealed this architecture of cover-up through more than 1,000 linear meters of original Reichsführer SS archives, identified as microcopy T175 on 536 rolls. In them, the word liquidate appeared frequently, the word kill almost never. And the most direct instructions on extermination were invariably those that did not exist in writing. That the system was so meticulous in its opacity was, in itself, proof that those responsible knew exactly what they were doing. On October 16, 1942, the first group of 10 female guards arrived at the Majdanek camp. They came from Ravensbrück. None of them had a criminal record. Some had young children or parents to support. Most had come to that job through the Reich Employment Services, lured by a salary of about 185 gross marks a month, free and uniform accommodation. The advertisement in the Hannoversche Courier of August 1944 was simply looking for female workers between 20 and 40 years of age for a military installation. No further details. What the historian Elissa Mailander documented in her study of the 28 female guards who served in Majdanek between 1942 and 1944 was something that the internal SS bodies themselves had not systematized or ordered: the extra violence, the violence that went beyond any official directive. Hildegard Lechert, born in Berlin in 1920, single with 2 children, arrived in Majdanek in October 1942. In interrogations following the Düsseldorf trial, survivors described her distributing inappropriate clothing to newly arrived prisoners. No country wear, dance wear, evening dresses, heels. There were warehouses full of practical clothes stolen from Holocaust victims. Lechert ignored them. Forcing a prisoner to survive the Polish winter in a party dress was, in its terms, a deferred death sentence. Another guard, whose identity is protected in the Hamburg archives under German privacy regulations, described beating female prisoners so normally that in an interrogation she clearly distinguished between her behavior at Ravensbrück, "I never hit a female prisoner," and at Majdanek, "I only rarely had to hit." The difference in the tone with which he said it was, according to Mailander, remarkable. The male SS personnel at Majdanek numbered between 900 and 1,200 men. The Aufseherinnen, the supervisors, were not 20. But in the hierarchy of power over female prisoners, they had a direct authority that men did not exercise in the same way. Hermine Braunsteiner, born in Vienna in 1919, arrived in Majdanek with the first group. She took over as shift leader and coordinated with the head of guard Else Erich the daily and working hours from an office inside the women's camp. In the documentation of the Düsseldorf trial, which lasted from 1975 to 1981 and was the longest trial in the history of the Federal Republic of Germany up to that point, the survivors repeatedly identified her. Prosecutor Dieter Ambach, who took the case in 1976, spent more than 5 years piecing together the facts. The penalties were light, but the record remained. Braunsteiner was located decades later living in Queens, New York, as a U.S. citizen under the surname Ryan. Journalist Simon Wiesenthal found it in 1964. She was extradited to Germany in 1973. What he took with him for almost 30 years was the exact memory of what he had done at Majdanek. And what we know about her comes from the minutes of the trial that she tried to avoid. On May 27, 1940, the SS Totenkopf Division crossed the La Bassée Canal in northern France. It was one of the worst days of the campaign for the British troops, who were retreating towards Dunkirk under constant pressure. The British 2nd Division sacrificed its units to keep the line of retreat open. On the outskirts of the small village of Paradis, about 99 men of the 2nd Royal Norfolk Regiment, surrounded and unable to escape, held out until their ammunition ran out. Many of them wounded, they finally surrendered with a white flag. His captors belonged to the 14th Company of the SS Totenkopf Division. Its commander was SS Hauptsturmführer Fritz Knöchlein, born in Munich on May 27, 1911. That day he was exactly 29 years old. Knöchlein had the prisoners searched and then marched them in single file by the wall of a barn. 2 machine guns opened fire simultaneously. Those who still showed signs of life were finished off with bayonet or pistol. The SS soldiers left convinced that no one was left alive. 2 soldiers survived. Private Albert Pooley and Private William O'Callaghan crawled from under the pile of bodies as the SS men left. Both were later picked up by another German unit, treated as prisoners of war, and sent to a hospital. Pooley spent years in German hospitals before being repatriated in 1943 for health reasons. O'Callaghan did not return to the United Kingdom until 1945, when the Allies liberated his prison camp. The British authorities were slow to believe Pooley's account. It seemed implausible to them that the German army would do such a thing to British prisoners. It was the arrival of O'Callaghan, whose testimony matched exactly, that triggered the official investigation. Of the 97 soldiers killed, the bodies were exhumed by the French in 1942 and reburied in a local cemetery. Madame Romanie Castel, a peasant from the area, was one of the civilian witnesses who identified Knöchlein during the trial held in Hamburg in October 1948. Colonel Alexander Scotland, head of the British War Crimes Investigation Unit, described in his memoirs the moment she pointed to the defendant in the courtroom. "That's him, that's the man." It was, according to Scotland, the most tense moment of 2 years of investigation. The British military trial began on October 11, 1948. The defense attorney argued that Knöchlein had not been present during the shooting and that British soldiers had used dum-dum bullets, illegal under the Hague Convention, which would have justified the reprisals. The court rejected both allegations. On October 25th, 6 British officers found Knöchlein guilty of war crimes. He was hanged in Hamelin prison on January 28, 1949, by the executioner Albert Pierrepoint. But what captured SS records, microfilmed on microcopy T175 at the National Archives in Washington, reveal is what transpired in the days and weeks immediately following the massacre within the organization itself. Colonel Günther Dalken, war correspondent of the Wehrmacht's propaganda department, arrived at Le Paradis the next day. He saw the bodies. They told him a story about dum-dum bullets. He left without further investigation. General Hübner, commander of the 16th Army Corps, demanded an investigation. SS Gruppenführer Karl Wolff, Himmler's chief of staff, surveyed the area shortly after the massacre, and his only complaint documented in the files was that there were too many unburied SS dead in the area. Theodor Eicke, commander of the Totenkopf Division, delayed any investigation. There was no court-martial for Knöchlein in 1940. On the contrary, Knöchlein continued to rise within the system. In October 1943, he was appointed commander of the 36th Regiment of the newly created 16th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. From March 1944 to January 1945, he commanded a unit of Norwegian volunteers in Courland. He received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. In December 1944, the man who had massacred 97 unarmed prisoners of war in 1940 had the Knight's Cross around his neck and commanded troops on the Baltic front. what no SS document mentions, because, as historian George Stein notes, it was not the custom of the SS to refer directly, especially in written communications, to atrocities, is the internal reaction that the episode provoked among the Totenkopf Division's own personnel. Reservists discharged from the division at the end of France's campaign complained of unmilitary practices. They all signed an oath of silence before leaving, pledging not to talk about what they had seen. But some requested to be reassigned to other units. Others openly said they planned to resign from the SS after the war. These statements reached Eicke, who informed his superior at Waffen-SS headquarters. The letters survive. Eicke to Juttner on October 22, 1940. Juttner to Eicke on October 24th. The storm, in the words of the historian, passed. It happened because the system was designed precisely for these storms to pass. Silence was mandatory. The chain of command protected those who had acted harshly, and the men who had seen too much returned to their homes with a signed oath that tied their tongues. Le Paradis was not the only such episode during the French campaign. While Knöchlein's company was performing at Le Paradis on 27 May, elements of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler were fighting near Wormhout. There, after capturing soldiers from the 2nd Warwickshire Regiment, a total of 11 officers and 320 men in the street fighting, followed by another 6 officers and 430 men during the night of retreat. Some of those prisoners were taken to a barn where they were forced to lie on the ground. Grenades were thrown inside. Those who survived the explosions were finished off. This episode, parallel in time to Le Paradis, did not generate any judicial proceedings during the war either. The precedent was established in 1940 and survived intact until December 1944, when in Malmedy, Piper's men acted following a logic that 4 years of impunity had consolidated. On December 17, 1944, during the German counter-offensive in the Ardennes, an armoured battle group of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper, captured approximately 150 to 175 American soldiers in the village of Baugny near Malmedy in Belgium. The prisoners were grouped in a field next to the road. Then someone on a half-track stood up and fired a pistol into the group. The machine guns opened fire. The only surviving American officer, First Lieutenant Virgil T. Larey, Jr., testified before a U.S. Senate committee about the exact details. When the firing ceased, after about 3 to 5 minutes, SS soldiers entered the group and shot those who were still moving in the head. As German vehicles passed along the road for the next few hours, some soldiers fired on the group of fallen from their vehicles. Like target practice, Larey described. After several weeks, when the Americans regained the ground, they found the 71 dead frozen in the snow exactly as they had fallen. The American tribunal that met in Dachau in 1946 sentenced 43 of the 73 defendants to death. Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th SS Panzer Army, was sentenced to life imprisonment. Joachim Piper, the head of the column, was also sentenced to death. None of these sentences were fully enforced. Under political pressure, the U.S. Senate hearings on the Malmedy trial in 1949, where defense attorneys alleged that the testimony had been obtained through torture, the sentences were commuted one after another. Piper was released in 1956. Sepp Dietrich was released from prison in 1958. Fritz Kramer, commander of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, turned less than 10 years old. Piper settled in eastern France in the village of Travis and lived there until 1976, when his house was burned down and he died in the fire. No one was ever prosecuted for his death. Captain Kurt Meyer, the youngest general in the Wehrmacht at the time of his appointment, was sentenced to death by a Canadian court on December 28, 1945, for ordering or tolerating the execution of Canadian prisoners of war during the Normandy campaign. He became the first German war criminal sentenced to death by the Western Allies. His sentence was commuted. He was released on September 7, 1954. Upon his release, Meyer became one of the main promoters of the HIAG, the Waffen-SS Veterans Association. In his memoirs, published in German in 1957, he denied any responsibility and called the accusations Allied propaganda. On November 3, 1943, the largest single-day massacre within the Nazi concentration camp system was designed. They called it Action Erntefest, Operation Harvest Festival. In the Lublin district, in less than 24 hours, 42,000 Jews were killed, 18,000 of them in Majdanek. The decision came from Berlin in direct retaliation for the uprisings at Treblinka on August 2nd and Sobibor on October 14, 1943. The Nazi leadership decided to liquidate all remaining forced Jewish laborers in the Lublin district to eliminate any possibility of further rebellions. It was the reverse logic of the labor system. Jews were needed as long as they were productive. The moment they demonstrated the capacity for organized resistance, they became a threat that had to be eliminated before it spread. The logistical coordination of the operation was on a scale that required weeks of preparation. The 8,000 Jews who remained in Majdanek were identified and separated in advance. Police battalions and SS security service units were specifically deployed from Lublin to the camp. The Lublin propaganda department sent vehicles equipped with radio transmission systems for the occasion. And that morning, before dawn, the camp's loudspeakers began to play music. Viennese waltzes, tangos, German marches. Erich Musfeld, head of the Majdanek crematorium, who later testified before the Krakow court about Auschwitz, described it bluntly. They played marches, German songs, and dance music. But another 10,000 Jews arrived that same day from outside the camp. Workers at the Poniatowa and Trauniki labor camps, located in the vicinity of Lublin, were forced to march to Majdanek on foot that morning. Survivor Henryka Ostrawska recalled that the roll call in the women's camp took place earlier than normal, even in the dark, in fog. Camp runners went through the barracks shouting, "All the beans! Roll call! All the beans! Roll call!" The prisoners began to run in different directions or tried to hide. The SS released dogs to assist in the search. Polish survivor Danuta Medrick, who could see the camp street from her position in the barracks, described the uniformed guards forming two rows facing each other, creating a corridor with machine guns. Then came the music, too loud to be normal, and then she saw groups of Jewish women, including girls, passing down the street in the camp toward Camp Phi. Jews from the camp and those arriving from outside were herded into the pits dug behind the new crematorium, along what the prisoners called the Lagerstrasse. There they had to take off their clothes. With their arms raised and their hands clasped behind their necks, they lined up by the graves. Men separated from women, women separated from men, and the executioners took turns. They shot for a while, returned to the SS dining room in the city to eat, and returned to the countryside. The operation did not stop for a moment. The shots were not aimed accurately. Many victims were still alive as the bodies of the next group crushed them as they fell on top of them. A member of a police battalion who took part in the operation and was interviewed decades later in Eberhard Fechner's documentary described women approaching the executioners asking, "Why? What have we done to them?" The guards themselves replied that they were sorry, that they could not do anything. "We were cursed, and some came towards us with their fists raised, and they shouted, 'Nazi pigs!' You can't blame them. We could have done the same if we had been the ones feeling the heat." The guards who voluntarily participated were given 2 liters of vodka and 400 cigarettes. In another testimony, the figure was 200 cigarettes and 2 liters of vodka. Both versions agree on substances, if not exactly quantities. That same account by Otto Z, documented by the historian Mailander, describes how that night he entered the next room and found his companions, Lausberg and Gehr, drinking and boasting that they had willingly participated in the executions and that they had shot those vagabonds. Lausberg's boots were still stained with blood. The female guards who were on duty that day testified in interrogations at the Dusseldorf trial that they had been locked in their barracks throughout the day with guards stationed in front of the door. The head of the guard reportedly told them that morning, "Today is a difficult day for us. It can go well, it can go badly. They have to be vigilant, and today alcohol is not allowed. Guard Lucy H. described seeing from the window a line of Jews advancing down the camp street. Many of them had to be carried because they had been shot on the way. Two survivors, Danuta Medrick and Marilla Reich, contradicted that version of events with precise statements. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, an Aufseherin entered each barracks and called, "All the Jewesses to the front." Then there was an inspection. The Jewish women were taken out to the field while the others did a roll call that lasted hours. Towards dusk, a drunken SS man who normally worked in the infirmary entered the barracks and said to the prisoners who were having dinner, "How can you eat with everything that is going on back there?" And he told them what was happening in the graves behind Camp 5. That drunken SS, who may have been the medic Wilhelm Reinartz, was not able to shut up. It was too much to bear, sober and silent. And so it was that many prisoners who had survived that day learned exactly what had happened, not from camp communiques, not from any official documents, but from the loose tongue of a guard who had had too much to drink. Around 9 p.m., Alice Orlowski, one of the Aufseherinnen, asked an SS acquaintance what had happened. The answer was, "You better not know." The next day, there were no Jews left in Majdanek. On May 15, 1941, Dr. Sigmund Rascher wrote a personal letter to Heinrich Himmler. Rascher was a Luftwaffe doctor and was researching the effects of altitude on pilots. The problem, he explained, was that the necessary experiments on humans were dangerous and no one volunteered. His proposal was straightforward. Could Himmler provide him with 2 or 3 professional criminals from the concentration camps? In the letter, Rascher added matter-of-factly that the subjects of the experiments could, of course, die. A week later, on May 22, 1941, the Reichsführer's personal secretary SS replied by letter signed with the initials KBR, Karl Brandt, a member of the SS with the rank of Sturmbannführer. The answer was yes. Camp prisoners would be naturally immediately available for high-altitude flight investigations. This correspondence was introduced into evidence at Nuremberg, catalogued as Document 1602-PS, and reproduced in the trial records of the International Military Tribunal. The altitude experiments were carried out at Dachau using a low-pressure chamber. The subjects were exposed to pressures equivalent to those of 12,000 meters of altitude. According to Rascher's own reports, at 28 degrees of body temperature, the subjects invariably died despite all attempts at resuscitation. In May 1942, Field Marshal Erhard Milch wrote personally to Himmler to express the special thanks of the Supreme Commander of the Air Force for the cooperation of the SS. When the altitude experiments ended, Rascher began hypothermia experiments. The subjects were immersed in ice water. The reports documented how long it took for their body temperature to drop when they lost consciousness. Resuscitation experiments included attempting to warm bodies with women's body heat. When Rascher told Himmler that there were difficulties in carrying out these experiments because Christian doctors could not take responsibility, Himmler replied that he would take personal responsibility. Wolfram Sievers, administrative director of the Ahnenerbe, the SS Ancestral Heritage Society, was put on trial during the so-called Doctors' Trial in Nuremberg. The Ahnenerbe, founded in 1935 as an organization dedicated to researching the racial origins of the German people, drifted towards pseudoscientific research and then experiments on prisoners. Sievers was hanged for crimes against humanity in June 1948. What the files reveal is the chain of authorizations. Each experiment had a piece of paper with a signature. Each signature was from someone who had received their authorization from someone higher up. The bureaucratic structure that allowed the experiments was the same that hid them. No one gave direct orders to kill. But the prisoners died anyway, with a general's signature on a piece of paper filed in Berlin. When the Totenkopf Division's reservists were discharged after the French campaign in the summer of 1940, some of them had seen too much. They had been to Le Paradis or heard about what had happened there. Some complained about their division's unmilitary practices. They requested to be reassigned to other units in case of future mobilization. The headquarters of the Waffen-SS recorded these complaints, and he responded with an oath of silence. All the licensed men signed a document pledging not to talk about what they had witnessed. General Theodor Eicke himself acknowledged in internal correspondence, letters dated October 22nd and October 24th, 1940, catalogued in microcopy T-175 of the National Archives in Washington, that he had received strong criticism from Waffen-SS headquarters for the complaints of the reservists. The Kommandostab Waffen-SS order to the Totenkopf Division of 27th August 1940 on the discharge of reservists made the framework clear. Men were returned to the reserve with their confidentiality obligations intact. But the storm passed. This mechanism was not unique to Le Paradis. It was part of the deliberate architecture of the SS cover-up. The oath of allegiance that each member of the SS took upon entering the organization, quoted verbatim in the Waffen-SS recruitment pamphlet entitled "The SS Calls You," presented as evidence at Nuremberg under document number 3429-PS, was of absolute radicalism. "I swear to you, Adolf Hitler, as Führer and Reich Chancellor, loyalty and courage. I promise to you and to those whom you have appointed to command me, obedience unto death. God help me." It was not an oath to the state or the nation. It was a personal oath to a man. And that man was not subject to any law outside himself, but Himmler went beyond that oath. In his speech at Posen on October 4, 1943, to the SS leaders, the speech recorded without their knowledge that ended up being document 1919-PS of the International Military Tribunal, Himmler told his generals that the extermination was a secret that should be taken to the grave. The exact phrase, read to the court by U.S. Attorney Major Farr in August 1946, was unmistakable. What they had done, they would continue to do, and that glorious chapter of their history has never been written and never should be. The instruction not to leave a written record, not to tell anything, to turn silence into a permanent operative norm, was explicit. And it wasn't just an abstract directive. It was the implicit recognition that what they were doing couldn't stand up to any outside scrutiny. Himmler knew exactly what he was instructing his men to conceal. What Himmler did not foresee was that the American army would capture the SS files before they could be destroyed. More than 1,000 linear meters of Reichsführer SS documents arrived in Alexandria, Virginia. They were microfilmed between 1956 and 1963 by the American Historical Association in cooperation with the National Archives. Posen's speech was among them. The instruction of silence had been in writing. The irony is perfect and brutal. The pattern was repeated at all levels of the system. In Majdanek, the prisoners who worked in the crematorium's Sonderkommando, the team of prisoners forced to remove the bodies from the gas chambers, load them into the carts, take them to the ovens, were periodically replaced. The head of the crematorium, Erich Moosfeld, who arrived in Majdanek on November 15, 1941, described to the Krakow Tribunal on Auschwitz that he had supervised 4 different teams of Sonderkommando throughout his service. The first composed of Polish Jews, the second of Russian prisoners of war, the third of French and German Jews, and the last one again of Russians. Each was replaced. The prisoners who operated the Sonderkommando and knew the process in exact detail simply disappeared to be replaced by others who, in turn, would disappear. The witness to the crime was also his victim. In the records of the 101st Reserve Police Battalion, the same pattern was repeated on a different scale. After the massacre at Josefov, Commander Trapp asked his men not to talk about the matter. It wasn't just a plea, it was the unspoken rule that everyone had internalized. And in the interrogations of the Hamburg Public Prosecutor's Office 20 years later, that rule was still in force. 1 man in 2 denied having been present. 1 in 3 said they did not remember the details. It was a taboo, one of the police officers said. Those who had been in the forest did not want to know more. Those who had not been there did not want to ask either. The silence was collective, and it had been built deliberately. From Le Paradis in 1940, to Josefov in 1942, from Himmler's instructions at Posen in 1943 to the oaths of discharge of the Totenkopf Division's reservists. It was an architecture of oblivion so carefully designed that it almost worked. Almost. On October 4, 1943, in the Polish city of Posen, Heinrich Himmler met with his SS generals. It was an internal conference, absolutely private, and Himmler spoke with a frankness that would never have been allowed in any official document. The text of that speech survived because someone recorded it. It was listed as Document 1919-PS of the International Military Tribunal. It was presented in Nuremberg. In it, Himmler described the extermination of European Jews without euphemisms. He said that his men had had to vacate villages and shoot Jews, including women and children, and that this was morally right, though difficult. He described the toughness that had been demanded of his men and the satisfaction of having completed the task. But the most telling sentence was the one concerning the secret itself. This is a glorious chapter of our history that has never been written, and that never should be. Himmler knew that what he had ordered could not withstand the light of day. He said it explicitly, bluntly, to his own generals. The instruction was that what they had done, and what they would continue to do, should be buried with them. What Himmler did not foresee was that the American army would capture the SS files before they could be destroyed. The thousands of boxes of documents that arrived in Alexandria, Virginia, were microfilmed between 1956 and 1963 by the American Historical Association in cooperation with the National Archives. More than 536 rolls of microfilm from the Reichsführer SS records collections identified as T175 microcopy in the National Archives. Posen's speech was among them. The man who believed that his secret would be buried forever had entrusted it to a bureaucratic apparatus incapable of destroying itself quickly enough. The SS had its own judicial system, domestic courts, own prosecutors, and the ability to prosecute its members for conduct that the command considered inappropriate. The problem was the definition of inappropriate. Colonel Karl Otto Koch was the first commander of Majdanek, appointed by Himmler in the summer of 1941. He was dismissed on August 1, 1942, and finally executed by the SS itself in 1945. The official position: embezzlement. Koch had appropriated property confiscated from the camp victims for personal use. He had enriched his private patrimony by using the money, clothes, and jewelry that the prisoners left behind when they entered the camp, and that by regulation had to go to the state coffers. Killing was not a crime within the system. Stealing, yes. Commander Hermann Florstedt, Majdanek's third official, was also dismissed and prosecuted on corruption charges. His successor, Martin Weiss, former commander of Neuengamme and Dachau, came to office in November 1943. Weiss had previously managed one of the most lethal camps in the system. His move to Majdanek was a movement of ordinary personnel within the system. This architecture of internal self-incrimination served a precise purpose: to demonstrate that the SS could monitor itself. If someone could be prosecuted, then the system had rules. And if the system had rules, then what happened inside its facilities was, in some sense, regulated. SS Judge Georg Conrad Morgan, who testified at Nuremberg, described this structure with unintentional precision. He had been commissioned to investigate corruption cases and in the process uncovered the machinery of mass murder. When his investigations became too long, Himmler personally ordered him in April 1944 to stop his files. The internal justice system of the SS existed precisely to ensure that certain crimes never reached any external court. On the 17th of August 1942, a month after the Josefov massacre, the 101st Reserve Police Battalion carried out its second major action. This time the target was the village of Lomazy, 1,700 Jews. The difference with Josefov was significant. In Josefov, the men had been led to the executions face-to-face, individually paired with their victims. walking alongside them from the village to the forest. The trauma had been enormous. That night, people drank until they lost consciousness. Some woke up shooting at the ceiling. In Wamazi, the structure was different. Auxiliary troops, the so-called Hiwis from the Troniki Training Center, captured Soviet recruits, would do most of the firing. German police would surround the perimeter. The massacre would be, psychologically, one step further away. The Hiwis arrived drunk. Lieutenant Nade, commander of the second company, was also drunk by the time the executions began. At one point, drunk on the edge of the moat, he ordered the elderly Jews, only those with long beards, to crawl naked on the ground while his non-commissioned officers beat them with clubs they had cut from the forest. When the SS officer commanding the Hiwis and Nade began to insult each other, the officer yelling that police shit doesn't shoot, and Nade responding that then his men would shoot them, the sergeants of the second company formed firing squads. They were rotated into groups of 8 to 10 men, with relays every 5 or 6 shots. Groundwater mixed with blood reached their ankles inside the pit. What the interrogations in Hamburg reveal is that the men who had been unable to fire in Josefov completed their shift in Womazi. Sergeant Bentheim described his men as delighted not to have to shoot themselves that time. Those who did fire described the experience without the same horror as Josefov. They did not have to look into each other's eyes with their victim. They didn't remember anyone's names. The habituation process was working. By the time 11,000 Jews were deported from Minzizek to Treblinka on August 25th and 26th, 1942, the men of the battalion already knew perfectly well where the trains were going. Heinrich Steinmetz, one of the non-commissioned officers, admitted decades later in his interrogation, "It was clear to us, and we all knew, that for the Jews affected these deportations meant the road to death." And yet, the most vivid experience that some remembered of Parkse was that they had to stand guard in a swampy meadow with wet feet. Ravensbrück was not just a concentration camp for women, it was also the factory where the female guards of the entire Nazi concentration camp system were trained. When the first Aufseherinnen arrived there in May 1939, the camp began to function simultaneously as a detention institution and as an indoctrination space for the guards themselves. Historian Elissa Mailänder documented that it was precisely in Ravensbrück that many of Majdanek's future guards learned that beating female prisoners was normal, not only tolerated but expected. Hermine Braunsteiner testified in her testimony that she was assigned to the penal barracks in Ravensbrück for 9 months. There she learned from her mentor how to treat female prisoners. Her mentor, according to her own account, beat the prisoners frequently. Braunsteiner added that at the time she herself did not have whips or canes, but the learning had been absorbed. Ravensbrück's service regulations, which applied to all women's camps, stated that the head of the guard, Oberaufseherin, acted as assistant to the camp commander and was to advise him on all matters relating to women. In practice, this gave the senior guards almost unlimited authority over the prisoners' daily lives. Recruitment was through the Reich's employment services, newspaper advertisements, or direct recruitment in armaments factories where prisoners worked. Candidates had to present a certificate of good police conduct, a resume, a photograph, and a medical certificate. Age between 21 and 45 years. No special qualifications required. What the application form found in the Ravensbrück archives, probably dated after 1942 or early 1943, explained to the candidates was that the women held in the camp had committed an offense against the popular community and now had to be isolated to prevent further harm. The guard did not need special qualifications, as the position involves only the supervision of these inmates. It was the language of ordinary administrative work, and that was how he presented himself. In Majdanek's record books, the dead systematically disappeared. When a prisoner died, his name was replaced by that of a newcomer who had not yet been officially registered. The prisoner count numbers, which were sent twice a day by telex from the camp headquarters to the central administration in Oranienburg, showed figures that never reflected the true magnitude of mortality. This practice, documented in the Düsseldorf trial archives and described by historian Elissa Mailander, was a deliberate mechanism to conceal the scale of the extermination. The WVHA's own central administration in Oranienburg had issued a directive in August 1942 to reduce mortality in the camps. Not because it was concerned about the prisoners, but because the high death rate interfered with the goal of exploiting their forced labor. But even that directive didn't change anything in Majdanek, because the camp administration ignored it and continued its usual practices, while manipulating the statistics to hide the fact from their own superiors. The Majdanek camp was liberated by the Red Army on July 23, 1944, so quickly that the SS did not have time to completely destroy its facilities. A Polish-Soviet commission of engineers, chemists, and architects immediately inspected the gas complex and confirmed that the 3 gas chambers behind Barrack 41 were extermination facilities designed to use Zyklon B and carbon monoxide. Chambers 1 and 2 measured 17.1 square meters each. Chamber 3 was 36.6 square meters. The cast-iron doors were airtight. The calculation of the French historian Jean-Claude Pressac estimated that up to 700 people could be killed at the Majdanek facility within a 24-hour period. And yet, according to historian Tomasz Krantz of the Majdanek State Museum Research Center, 60% of the camp's victims did not die in the gas chambers. They died of starvation, disease, forced labor, and direct physical violence by guards. The record books said otherwise. On July 13, 1942, when the men of the 101st Battalion returned from Józefów to their barracks in Biłgoraj, no one spoke. Those who had been in the forest did not want to count. Those who had not been there did not want to ask. He drank himself until he lost consciousness. Commander Trapp made his rounds consoling the men and repeating that the responsibility lay with the higher authorities. And then silence was imposed. The whole subject was taboo. This phrase, uttered by one of the policemen interrogated in the 1960s, sums up the mechanism that historian Christopher Browning identified in the Hamburg court records as the psychological basis of the collective cover-up. No one was going to voluntarily tell what they had done, not even 20 years later, before the prosecutors most insisted on not remembering, not having been present, having been in another place during the shootings. Franz Kastenbaum was an exception. He appeared unannounced at the Hamburg State Prosecutor's office without having been summoned. He said he had not found peace for years. He described how he had intentionally missed the 4th shot, how he had fled into the woods and vomited, how he had stood alone among the trees for 2 or 3 hours. And he said why he had come. Because he had tried to hide the matter for too long and could no longer do so. But Kastenbaum was the exception that proves the rule. Most of the 210 men questioned denied, minimized, or did not remember. Some replied that they had not heard Trapp's offer to leave the peloton. Others said they didn't remember if the commander had done it. Several insisted they had had no choice. And yet, there was the record. There was the list of those who had stepped aside. There were the crossed testimonies of dozens of men who remembered the same events from different angles. The archive of the Hamburg trial, to which Browning obtained access on condition that the full surnames of most of the deponents not be revealed, was the map of a collective crime that had tried to erase itself for 20 years and yet had survived in the fragmented memory of its own perpetrators. The investigation was shelved without convictions in 1972. There was no trial. Major Wilhelm Trapp wept before his men at Józefów. He offered the possibility of withdrawing. He made his rounds that night, comforting the younger cops. When a similar incident occurred shortly afterwards in the village of Alexandrov, where the Jews had been gathered but Troniki's auxiliary units did not appear, Trapp let the Jews go, without giving any explanation to his men. But Trapp never refused an order. He never put his discomfort in writing. He never wrote to Hamburg requesting that the battalion be relieved of its duties in Poland. Lieutenant Buchmann did, and was transferred back to Germany. Trapp does not. The chain of command of the SS and police units functioned with a specific characteristic. Pressure was transmitted downwards with absolute fluidity, but resistance could never be transmitted upwards effectively. Himmler, in his Posen speech, had even acknowledged that men with shattered nerves could be sent to collect their pension, but that option implied withdrawing from the system, not questioning it. The result was that mid-level commanders like Trapp found themselves caught between their own personal malaise and the authority structure around them. They could offer small concessions to their men, the chance to get out of the platoon, the chance to sneak away in the dark. But the mission was completed anyway. The machinery worked so efficiently precisely because it did not depend on the enthusiasm of each individual. It depended on collective inertia, habit, peer pressure, and a bureaucracy that kept spinning regardless of how those who served it felt. On the 10th of June 1944, 4 days after the Normandy landings, elements of the 3rd Battalion of the 4th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, Der Führer, part of the 2nd SS Das Reich Division, entered the village of Oradour-sur-Glane in central France. The women and children were locked in the village church. The men were taken to several barns. Then the SS soldiers opened fire and threw incendiary grenades. 642 civilians were killed, including 247 women and 205 children. Only 6 people survived. The town was burned. Historian George Stein, in his study of the Waffen-SS, called Oradour the most blatant military atrocity committed by SS combat troops on the Western Front. The commander of the responsible unit, SS Sturmbannführer Adolf Diekmann, was killed in action shortly afterwards. His superior, SS Standartenführer Sylvester Stadler, and the division's commander, SS Brigadeführer Heinz Lammerding, were never prosecuted by the German courts in their lifetime. Lammerding was sentenced to death in absentia by a French military court in 1951. He died in Bad Tölz, West Germany in 1971, without having been extradited. Stadler died in 1995. A German court began investigating the case at the beginning of the 21st century. In 2014, 70 years after the massacre, the trial finally began in Cologne against the last SS survivor who had been present that day, a 94-year-old man. The process ended without a conviction. The dead of Oradour are still there. The French government decided to leave the ruins of the town exactly as they were on June 10, 1944, as a permanent memorial. No one has moved them. In August 1942, when the 101st Reserve Police Battalion began deporting Jews from the northern villages of the Lublin district to the train station to send them to Treblinka, no one explained to them what Treblinka was. It was not necessary. Heinrich Steinmetz, one of the unit's non-commissioned officers, said it clearly in his testimony. It was clear, and we all knew, that for the Jews concerned these deportations meant the road to death. We suspected they would be killed in some kind of camp. Treblinka was not Auschwitz. At Treblinka there was no selection, no work barracks, no number tattooed on the arm. Treblinka was a center of immediate extermination. Trains arrived, Jews were driven directly to the gas chambers, and bodies were incinerated. The whole process, from the arrival of the train to death, lasted less than 2 hours. Between July 22, 1942, and mid-August, some 300,000 Jews from Warsaw were deported to Treblinka. The capacity of the camp was completely overflowing. Bodies piled up faster than they could be cremated. Himmler and the extermination camp supervisor, Christian Wirth, had to travel personally to Treblinka to reorganize it. Franz Stangl was summoned from Sobibor, another extermination center temporarily inactive due to works on the railway track, and appointed as the new commander. In the Christopher Browning documented it like this: the extermination machinery had temporarily stalled precisely because of its efficiency. There were too many dead to process. The Majdanek women's camp knew what gas chambers were. Guard Georg W. declared that it was an open secret that Jewish prisoners were gassed there. He added that the entire city of Lublin knew what the gas chambers were used for. The city of Lublin is 5 kilometers from the countryside. After all that has been documented, the police battalions, the women's guards, the medical experiments, the massacres, the oaths of silence, there is one last secret that the perpetrators themselves worked harder to bury than anyone else. It was possible to act differently, not in the abstract sense, in the concrete and verifiable sense that in the summer of 1942, in the forest outside Josefov, dozens of men asked to be relieved and were. A lieutenant wrote to his superiors requesting the transfer because he was not suitable for non-police duties, and was transferred back to Hamburg. Members of the guard who refused to shoot in Wamazi slipped away through the trees and were not punished. In the SS command structure, even Himmler himself had explicitly recognized that men whose nerves are over could ask for their pension. What the Hamburg court records reveal with devastating clarity is that the real obstacle was not the fear of physical reprisal. It was the pressure of conformity, the fear of being seen as cowardly or weak by peers. It was identification with the group. It was the gradual renunciation of individual perspective through a process that began with indoctrination, continued with habituation, and ended with indifference. Lieutenant Buchmann, the man who ended up requesting the transfer, explained it more precisely than anyone else. He was a reserve officer and a Hamburg businessman of a certain age, he said. He had no military career ambitions. He didn't care what his superiors thought of him. He had his business at home. The company leaders, on the other hand, were young and they were career policemen who wanted to get to something. That was all. That was the difference between those who could refuse and those who could not. It was not ideology. It was not congenital cruelty. It was the race. It was the fear of the judgment of the comrades. It was wanting to achieve something within a system that rewarded obedience and punished dissent with insignificance. And when, decades later, in interrogations in the 1960s, the surviving police officers tried to explain why they had obeyed, most could not find the words. Time and memory had done their work. One of them said it more honestly than the others. Back then, we didn't think about it. Only years later did we realize what had happened. Only then did it occur to me for the first time that this had not been right. That man had killed 20 Jews in Josefov before asking to be relieved. The SS records survived the SS. The microfilmed archives in Alexandria, Virginia, the files of the International Military Tribunal, the minutes of the Dusseldorf trial that lasted from 1975 to 1981, the interrogations of the Hamburg Public Prosecutor's Office that the historian Christopher Browning studied in the 1980s, with the express permission not to reveal the full surnames, all of that is there, accessible, verifiable, permanent. Hermine Braunsteiner, the Majdanek guard who lived for decades as an American citizen under the surname Ryan, was finally tried in Dusseldorf. Fritz Knöchlein, the officer who ordered the Le Paradis massacre, was hanged in 1949. Wolfram Sievers, the director of the Ahnen Erbe, who oversaw the experiments on prisoners, was hanged in June 1948. But most were not tried. Most died in their beds, in normal houses, in normal cities, with their secrets intact. What did not die with them were the facts. The 42,000 dead of Operation Harvest Festival. The 100 soldiers of the Royal Norfolk Regiment shot by the wall of a barn in Le Paradis. The 71 Americans killed in the snow of Malmedy. The 1,500 Jews of Josefov, whose bodies were left in the forest unburied because no one had made plans for it. And the ultimate secret that they were not monsters. They were ordinary people who made ordinary decisions within an extraordinarily criminal system. That is the hardest thing to accept, and it is precisely for this reason the most important thing that we must not forget.